Hi, I'm Michael Strother, Chair of the Ann Arbor Guide to Architecture Committee. We're here today in downtown Ann Arbor to look at the Kempf House, a beautiful example of Greek Revival architecture. You see behind me the Kempf House, and you note at first that the building is white. The building is rectilinear in plan and has columns on the front. Well, back in the 1800s, the first of these buildings in Greek Revival was actually done in public architecture. Things like hotels, banks, city halls, and capitol buildings were Greek Revival in style. Also, many famous people lived in Greek Revival homes. Andrew Jackson, James K. Polk, and Robert E. Lee among them. In the 1800s, there was a desire to communicate via architecture a sense of the classics. This was fostered by our educational system and the classical training, and also at the time in the 1820s the Greeks had a war of independence from the Turks. We had our War of 1812 with Britain, and that feeling of wanting to be independent and having our own nation was being communicated through architecture. In the North, it was part of nationalism. In the South, it was part of Romanticism. So, what are the elements of a Greek Revival style building? You'll see the pediment, the triangular shape at the top. Well, that, the columns, in this case, we have square columns. They could be, however, Doric, the more squat, heavier shaped columns that do not have a base. They could be the Ionic order, which has the curled tops. They could be Corinthian, or the leafy-like top that we're used to seeing on Roman temples. The buildings themselves are typically symmetrical. In a residential style home, the door would be set off to one side, off the porch. There'd be a long hallway. The windows are typically to the European style, floor to ceiling. And inside the building, the ceilings are typically high. So we're going to take a tour through the Kempf House today and see in detail some of the elements of a Greek Revival style residence.
Hello, my name is Carol Mull. Welcome to the Kempf House Museum. You're in the entry hall with me now of the house that was built in 1853 for Henry Bennett. We've interpreted it, however, to the 1880s period when the Kempfs lived here, because we're telling their story as it involved the legacy they left with us in bringing music and music culture to Ann Arbor. But first I'll step back in time and tell you a little bit about the Greek Revival architecture. You can see here, and as you came into the house, certain motifs that were popular of the Greek Revival style. But they're not truly Greek Revival in being what one might see in Greece, where you would have the huge temple front. Yes, we have a temple front on this house, but it's very small, and there are not an even number of openings on the house. There's a door and 2 windows on the front, so you have 3 as opposed to 6 or 8. But the house still has a symmetry and balance that was part of the Greek Revival style. Greek Revival was very popular in the 1850s. It had been popular in New York, and Henry Bennett came from New York, as many of the people who moved to the Midwest and Ann Arbor did. And they brought their housing choices with them when they came here. And Greek Revival was popular then, and they brought it here. But when they brought it to the Midwest, they did not have all of the elements that they might want in their house, and so they had to make modifications. Not only that, they were forced to make modifications based on their middle income. This is a middle class house. So you'll find that instead of large round columns on the front, they're square columns because you could have the lumber cut into square faces much more easily and inexpensively. They do have the beautiful cast iron Anthemian grills on the house, both the front and the sides. But those were something that could be sent by train, special ordered, and they're seen in other houses both in Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti. Otherwise, the house has the sense of being Greek revival with the other elements that one might commonly see, but on a moderate scale. So that's what we find in here today. You might be surprised by the wallpaper in the Kempf's library, the room we're in right now. But it was not uncommon at the time for middle-class Americans to choose a wall covering such as this. It has bright colors because these bright colors would stand out at night, especially in rooms like this that had very poor lighting. In the late 1800s, families had gas lighting if they lived in the downtown. This house was right at the edge, you can imagine. It's on Division Street of what was considered the village and then the rest of Ann Arbor. So they actually had gas lighting in an early period, but the gas lighting was not at all reliable. And so at night, the rooms could be very dark and dreary and dim, especially in the wintertime when the sun would go down very early. So a wallpaper such as this, with these bright pink colors and the green that stands out, were very popular. And there was something else about this wallpaper that made it popular. For middle-class homes such as this, unlike the wealthy and upper-class homes in America that you often see when you go to museums, they would have fabric wallpapers. Here, in this middle-class home, fabric wall covering was way too expensive, and therefore they could do a paper wall covering that looked like it was cloth. You can see that this has a fold effect, which makes it, it simulates a silk, a hand-painted silk wall covering. So this was a very popular item in middle-class homes in this period of time. You've entered the music studio of Pauline and Reuben Kempf. In most houses of this period, when the house was built in 1853, this was the front parlor. But when the Kempfs moved in 1888, this became not only the front parlor, but essentially and primarily their music studio. Reuben Kempf trained for music at the Royal Academy of Music in Stuttgart, Germany. It was the premier institution of the time. And Pauline Wiedemann trained at the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music. She had a beautiful contralto voice, and for the time she was in her teens, had been performing on stage. The two of them had a very happy marriage, moved into this house, and transformed this room into this music studio and brought their music, piano, and voice culture, voice lessons to not only the citizens of Ann Arbor, but all this area. Reuben's students came from other states, from Canada. He was renowned as a great teacher, very strict, however. And Pauline, his wife, was noted for not only singing and performing, but for teaching others to sing and perform as well. They taught right here in this room, and it pretty much looks the way it did when they first brought this piano and music to Ann Arbor. I say this piano and bringing music to Ann Arbor because at the time there was no other grand piano in Ann Arbor until Reuben was able to buy this Steinway from a student. In fact, the University of Michigan was sponsoring a performance by Madame Schumann-Heink, the premier singer of the time, and she came to this house and visited and asked if she might borrow this piano because there was not one suitable And she did indeed take this piano out of this house and have it carted over to the hall where she performed, as well as the full-length mirror so she could see herself before she went on stage. The Kempfs had many famous, world-famous musicians as friends, both from their time of training and from their lives spent sharing music with the community and the rest of this country. So this music culture carried on. They took it to the halls and studios in this city, and they also took it to the churches. Reuben was the organist and choir master at St. Andrew's Church, just down Division Street, for over 30 years. Pauline was the organist in several churches. She also sang at many events and in churches as well. And some of these pictures we have around the room reflect their careers. You may have noticed from the outside that we have a beautiful garden. There's not as much to see at this time of year, but in the springtime it's beautiful. One of the centerpieces of the garden is the magnolia tree that Pauline Wiedemann Kempf planted at the turn of the century, well, 1900th century. It blooms every spring with big, bright flowers. And also, there are other things in the garden that are worth taking a look at. The beautiful roses. Pauline was a wonderful gardener. She would teach voice lessons in the house and then run outside between lessons if her students were late or there was some time and work on her roses. She was very proud of her roses. So there are roses still growing all on the side of the house and in the front. And then another plant that's still blooming in the garden is the double bloodroot. It's a rather uncommon plant, and it has beautiful flowers. It's one of the first plants to bloom in the spring, and it has very delicate flowers and large green leaves in the plant. So she had planted double bloodroot, and it's often hard to get it to take, and hers took beautifully. And so that's all along the fence line. Then, of course, there are traditional lilacs and other plants that one would expect to see in a garden of this time period. This photograph shows Pauline Wiedemann and her daughter, Pauline Wiedemann Kempf, in the garden. It gets a little confusing sometimes. Anyhow, they both love to garden, as I said before, and they were photographed here alongside the house in front of the beautiful roses. And interestingly, Pauline Wiedemann Kempf's daughter, Elsa, herself was an avid gardener. After she finished college and moved to Chicago, she taught some piano lessons. She worked as a teacher for some time here, and then taught piano lessons like her mother and gardened as well. We're in the Kempf sitting room right now, and I want to point out this organ. It adds to the story that we already know of why the Kempfs were so important in Ann Arbor in terms of bringing their music culture to this area. They were not the only ones. Like so many other Germans who migrated to this area, they brought with them a very strong and expert understanding of music. Many of the Germans did. And many of them made that their living in Ann Arbor. This is an example of that. This is the Allmendinger organ. You may have heard of Allmendinger Park in Ann Arbor. That is named after the Allmendinger family. The Allmendinger organ was made by the Ann Arbor Organ Company. And this is a picture here of there are two pictures up here you can look at more closely later of the building where these organs were made. They were very popular. Organs were very popular, much more common in homes actually than pianos, which were a more costly item. This was a pump organ, and it was sold in later years through the Sears catalog. This was one of the higher end models because it had all of the embellished wood here, as well as the shelves and places to hold your lighting. This organ had a couple of features that Allmendinger himself invented and promoted. One of those was a special trap right here, that this little panel, as you can see, it goes in and out, and that was supposed to be, it was designed to keep mice from getting into the organ and eating the bellows. But I'm thinking that there must have been very large mice at the time, because there's at least a 2-inch gap there. Anyhow, I don't know how effective it was, but the other thing that he introduced was a special device here that had a red to white paper that would change depending on how you pumped. And if you stopped pumping hard enough, it would move, and you'd know you had to pump harder to keep enough air in the bellows for your sound to come out. So the Kempfs had both all sorts of musical instruments in the house, because they had the grand piano, of course, in the music studio. Then Reuben was selling pianos out of the house, and their daughter Elsa played violin. So the house was just filled with all sorts of music, as their lives were.